CBGA have also, like every year, analyzed the union budget, and we have brought out a publication. It's titled In Search of Inclusive Recovery. And we will be releasing that publication before 8 o'clock India time today, before the webinar gets over. So I will share the link for that publication in the chat box before the end of the program today. And the sequence of today's program is that we will start with a short 10-minute presentation by one of my colleagues, Malini Chakravarti. She will share with you all the key observations and findings of CBGA's analysis of the budget. And then we will devote the remaining 1 hour and 45 minutes to the panel discussion. So the discussion would be moderated by Professor Praveen Jha. And so Professor Jha is on the faculty of Center for Economic Studies and Planning at Jawaharlal Nehru University. So we all know him very well, a very eminent economist who has worked and published extensively on a range of sectors and issues. So he's also associated with a number of social movements since long, providing them guidance on policy issues. And Professor Praveen Jha is also one of the co-founders of CBGA and currently the chairperson of our board of trustees. So we are very delighted to have Professor Jha with us for moderating today's program. And we have 4 very eminent panelists. Let me introduce each of them to you briefly. So Jashodhara Dasgupta is on our panel. She's a feminist researcher, policy advocate, and activist. Jashodhara has worked extensively on health issues from a human rights perspective. She had co-founded Sahyog, a well-known women's health rights organization. She also led Sahyog for more than 2 decades. Jashodhara is also a co-founder and currently a co-convener of a coalition of feminist researchers and activists called the Feminist Policy Collective. Professor Jayati Ghosh is one of our panelists, and Professor Ghosh is on the faculty of Department of Economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. But before joining the University of Massachusetts Amherst, she taught economics at Jawaharlal Nehru University for more than 3 decades. So Professor Ghosh has been part of several high-level committees nationally and globally. Her work has been recognized through a number of awards, both national and international. So we all know her as a very eminent economist, but she also has been associated with a number of social movements, supporting them through her intellectual leadership. And we are really glad to have Professor Ghosh on this panel. We also have with us Professor R. Nagaraj, who is currently a visiting faculty at the Center for Development Studies, CDS in Trivandrum. And he is a professor of economics at the IGIDR, Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Research in Mumbai. Professor Nagaraj is an eminent economist who has done extensive research on India's industrialization, applied macroeconomic challenges, public sector, labor market, and economic statistics, among other issues. He has also served as a member of various high-level committees and advisory groups of the Government of India, state governments, the Central Statistical Organization, and the Reserve Bank of India. And we are also very glad to have with us in the panel Mr. Ravi Duggal. Ravi is a sociologist, a public health researcher, and an activist closely associated with Jan Swasthya Abhiyan, which is the India chapter of the People's Health Movement. So earlier he has worked as the International Budget Partnership, IBP's country director for India. And Ravi has worked extensively on issues of fiscal governance in India as well as in a number of other Asian countries. And earlier he has worked with the Foundation for Research in Community Health, with Swiss Aid, and the Mumbai-based organization focusing on health issues called Sehat. So we are really glad to have the 4 eminent panelists with us. And without taking any more time, I would request Professor Praveen Jha to please take over the moderation of today's program.
Thank you, Subrat. Privileged to have this task of moderating this discussion by this extremely eminent panel. All of them, as you said, are very well known. So let me only add my words of welcome to each one of them. Before we come to them, we will start with a brief presentation on behalf of CBGA, which is based on the report that Subrat mentioned, which will be released before today's program is over. Malini will do this presentation, Malini Chakravarti. She will take about 10 minutes or so, approximately. And then we get on with the panel. The order of the panel presentations will be the following. We first start with Professor Jayati Ghosh, then Professor R. Nagaraj, then we have Jashodhara Das Gupta and Ravi Tukkal after that. As has been indicated, each one of you, please take about 12 minutes or so. And then after your inputs, we will have further conversations between you and the other participants. So let me invite Malini, please.
Thank you, Professor Jha. I'm sorry, I apologize in advance. I would not be able to keep my video open because of network connections. So let me start my presentation. I'd request my colleague to please start sharing the screen. Yeah, so our publication this time is titled as In Search of an Inclusive Recovery. Now, if we look at what has happened in the budget, there are, of course, the context we all know. It is not very different from what we saw last time. There is this problem of high unemployment, hunger, destitution, and of course, widening social and economic inequalities, among other various problems that we still face today.
Yes, please.
Yeah, so the bright spot, if one may call it, is the better than estimated tax collection. So we see an increase in tax collection, but one reason, of course, is that, last time, next slide, please. Last time's estimates of tax collection were most likely an underestimation. So that is one definite reason why we see this increase. The other reason that has happened, because the tax collection improvement has come this time at least largely from direct tax collection. Whether that is of course an improvement, but not all of it, because it also kind of signifies increasing income concentration, because it has mainly come from surge in corporate profits, which has been at the cost of MSME sector. So there has been some corporates have taken up the market share, and there has been, for various other reasons, increase in corporate profits, which kind of gets reflected in the increase in direct taxes. And similar things have happened even at the individual level, because we know a large majority of the population, even in the middle class, have lost jobs or are earning less, whereas there is a small sector who have seen their income or go up. Now, sorry, the previous slide, Suraj. So in terms of, despite this increase, what we see is that tax to GDP ratio still remains low. And it is in fact still remain low compared to 2017-18. Next slide. So the second thing we notice is, again, despite this increase, the share of indirect taxes, which are known to be regressive, is still very high, higher than what it was in 17-18. If just as a comparison, this is at the time when GST was introduced. So yes, in terms of, it is a bright spot, but there are certain things which are of concern. And therefore, perhaps we also see that the government projections for this year, 2022-23 BE, we see a drop, and it doesn't grow at the same rate, which of course one doesn't know the reasons, but it does seem that the government doesn't believe that this kind of growth or this kind of increase will continue. Next slide, please. But despite this increase, one major thing that remains a concern is the amount of total tax collected by the center is not, that does not get shared with the states. So what we see is that it is, slowly over time, this amount, that is the amount that does not get shared with states, has been growing up. And during the pandemic years, actually, you see a more or less consistent increase. So it reached a peak of 23% in last year's RE. The government projects that it will drop to 19% this year, in the coming year. One needs to see what actually happens to that. So this is about tax collection. Next slide, please. Now, the only thing is that the other aspect of revenue mobilization, which is non-tax revenue, including disinvestment, especially disinvestment, have not really been able to, have not performed as projected. So therefore, what we see is a slight increase in total receipts. But in contrast to that, what we see in the case of expenditure, that it actually declines as share of GDP. So the main thing, next slide, please. Yeah, so one of the things which is extremely noticeable given the context that we see the budget being presented is a number of subsidies actually have been cut. So it is food subsidy, fertilizer subsidy. We see a decline. We also see it in terms of petroleum subsidy, whereas in case of if you look at only the fertilizer subsidy and see it in terms of BE of last year and BE of this year, then it is not a drop. It is a drop only if you see it in terms of BE and RE allocations. So coming to this, obviously then, next slide please, what has happened is that the increase in revenue, total revenue or total receipts of the government, it seems has been utilized mainly to reduce or cut back, reduce the fiscal deficit. So we see that in 2020-21 actuals, it was supposed to be as high as 9.2%. And in the next year, it's supposed to come down to 6.4%. Now, this, of course, has implications for expenditure in all sectors, whether it is social sector, economic sectors, and on allocations for marginalized sections. Beginning, next slide, please. Beginning with education. This is one area where we actually see some increase, even though slight. There has been at least some increase in it. It is more or less in tune with what the government says is going to be the rate of growth of GDP. But and secondly, what has happened is even the Samagra Shiksha Abhiyan, which is the key centrally sponsored schemes for school education, which has been revamped, also has seen some increase. But at the same time, it is still lower than the pre-pandemic level of allocation. Coming to the other thing that we notice in the education budget, that unlike last year, there has been some process of beginning to roll out the national education policy related interventions. So we see new schemes such as Exemplar and Aspire, where their allocations have been made. And we also see that, an NEP 2020, for instance, recognizes the advantages of technology in education. But, and the budget piece also actually mentioned these several times. But when we see the budgetary allocation, there's something called a PM E-Vidya, which has dropped. Also, the budget for existing midday meal scheme, which is now called Pradhan Mantri Poshan Shakti Nirman, we see a slight drop. Coming to health, next slide, please. Coming to health, what we see is there has been again a slight nominal increase. But in terms of GDP, it remains stagnant. This is the reason why this is important, that perhaps there should have been more allocation, because we see both in terms of utilization levels of both health ministries, it has remained high. So therefore, the ability of to absorb higher resource is there. So maybe it should have been increased. The interesting thing is that this time what the focus is on strengthening health infrastructure, through schemes like Pradhan Mantri Swasthya Suraksha Yojana and PM Ayushman Bharat Health Infrastructure Mission. This is, of course, a welcome move, especially in the backdrop of the pandemic. We see some modest increase in allocations for insurance-based schemes. Also, the National Health Mission, which is the government's flagship central scheme for health, has seen a marginal increase. There is one very important thing, perhaps the budget mentioned, which is about national mental health. While something has been talked about launching a national telemental health, right now there is no allocations given for it. The next slide, please. Now, coming to nutrition, what we see is that this is again actually was supposed to be one of the key interventions, given that what NHFS 5 has said. What we see instead is that there has been not much increase. It has remained stagnant, which of course raises questions about how child malnutrition concerns are going to be addressed. Even in terms of what is known as supplementary nutrition program, what is provided is far short of what is required. If you see in terms of the gap in cost of supplying SNP, keeping in line with the inflation. Coming to the other major thing which has been in talk and has been demanded many times is the issue of enhancing the honoraria and other working conditions of Anganwadi workers. What we see is that there's been a small increase in outlay for agriculture, but it is very minor. Within that, we see there has been actually increase in allocation for fisheries and animal husbandry. So there is a win some and lose some, but because at the same time, we also see a decline in for crop sector. There has been Rashtriya Krishi Vikas Yojana, one of the very important schemes under the sector, has been revamped and restructured. But what we see in terms of allocations, it almost remains similar to what it was last year. Coming to rural development, what we see is that rural development or expenditure on rural development had gone up significantly in the last 2 years. And the main reason was that MGNREGA expenditure had gone up significantly. Now, this year, we see a minimal increase if compared to last year's BE. The significant thing, of course, is that MGNREGA's allocation remains constant if compared to last year's BE and has dropped significantly compared to last year's RE. That is one reason that the government has been actually focusing, a big thrust has been given towards increasing capital expenditure throughout this budget. And therefore, that one of the reflection in that is that the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana has increased quite a lot, which is, of course, a welcome development. Coming to women, we of course see not much increase even here. What was required, of course, if at all increase has happened, that has happened under Part B of what is known as the gender budget statement, but that is mainly because of the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, urban, which has increased. Secondly, coming to the National Rural Mission, Livelihood Mission, which was very important, plays an important role in facilitating women's rural employment of rural women through self-help groups, has actually seen a slight fall. Coming to children, minor increase. Overall, if the increase has happened, it's mainly because on account of education-related interventions. Other than that, when you look at the concerns of growing violence against children and that of increasing child labor, what we see is it's a mixed bag, because we have some increase in outlays for mission for in the domain of child protection, but a dip in allocations for child labor. Coming to the last two, this thing is for scheduled caste, we see some increase again, for both Department of Social Justice and Empowerment and for Ministry of Tribal Affairs. Slight increase. The good thing and the positive thing perhaps is that this time we have seen budgetary allocation for post-matric scholarship for scheduled castes has been increased. Similarly, there has been slight increase in budget for Eklavya model of residential schools for children. Finally, when we come to the persons with disabilities, what we see is, of course, it has always been a small amount as percentage of GDP, of course, very small, but also otherwise. We see a dip over the years. And the only specific announcement we see this time is mainly insurance scheme. So on the whole, the government has definitely tried to use the increase in receipts by trying to cut down on overall expenditure. And within expenditure, the focus has been mainly on capital expenditure, which there are questions about how much employment it can create, specifically given that MGNREG, on the other hand, has seen a huge drop. Thank you so much. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Malini, for this very good overview of the sectoral movements, major schemes, etc. And now we come to our first panelist, Professor Jayati Ghosh. There are some suggestions that we have for each one of the panelists, but of course, it is your call how much you want to take that into account and how much you want to go beyond that and so on. So for Professor Ghosh, there are three issues which CBGA thought if she could also take into consideration. Number one, the buoyancy reported in tax revenue and its sustainability. Two, the challenge of unemployment, underemployment, given this budget's extensive reliance on supply side measures. And number three, reducing the budget support for one of the lifelines for rural India, for those who are at the bottom of the pyramid, NREGA, and overlooking the need for an urban employment guarantee program, which many had suggested across the political divide. So with that, Professor Ghosh, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Praveen and Shubrat, for inviting me, and Malini for that really excellent summary of some of the important points in the budget. I thought that was very clear and concise. And, you know, you've already picked on the issues I was planning to talk about, and I'll get to the issue of tax buoyancy at the end. But just to put this in context, let's remember that India actually had the weakest fiscal response to the pandemic globally. In terms of the G20 countries, in terms of middle-income countries, we are the only country in the world which in 2021, according to the government's own statement to the IMF, reduced its total spending. Central government spending went down by nearly 6,000 crore in 2021, in a period of massive devastation, job loss, hunger, poverty increase, etc. We know all of that. And we are unusual. Nobody else did that. What did it mean? Well, the consequences are well known, not just the increase in inequality, but the vastly increased material suffering of ordinary people and the huge implications for employment. The multiplier effects of cutting down spending in a period when private consumption is falling has collapsed, when private investment is not going to happen either, then the government also cuts spending. You can see how this actually involves a downward spiral. And the effects of that downward spiral are what continued on into 21-22. We don't know yet the exact level of government spending in 21-22. And this is extraordinary because it's not necessary. We are not constrained by large sovereign debt concerns. The inflation issues are coming from entirely different quarters. They are not coming from a broader macroeconomic imbalance. So the fact that the government has tied its own hands in this way is really quite remarkable. I think the issue of employment guarantee, which has been flagged, it's absolutely critical. So if you look at even this year's allocation for the MNREGA, it was way below what is required, 73,000 crore, nothing, okay? In December, they announced they would add another 25,000 crore because there was massive shortfall. Already most of that money had been spent, states were in deficit, they were all asking for more funds in December. They announced 25,000 crore, which hasn't yet come, but let's even assume that that comes. That comes to a 98,000 crore in the current year. Even that will leave a deficit of at least 21,000 crore of unpaid dues. So any additional spending of next year has to recognize that you first have to pay off this year's dues of 21,000 crore, which means that the allocation they have provided, again, that of 73,000 crore, is just about 50,000 crore. It's nothing. With the current level of households registered for work and therefore involving labor demand, you would not be able to provide more than 20 days per household. And of course, remember, it's not just the direct work. It is the fact that this then contributes to demand for local enterprises, for small scale services, for small micro enterprises. So the more you deny people any kind of purchasing power, the more you are further killing off the MSMEs, which have been the worst affected throughout this period and which have been closing by the hundreds every day, or with facing massive declines in sales and in livelihood from this. So yeah, it's unbelievable, but it is true that they have continued to and are adding to this, and of course completely rejecting all the discussion on urban employment guarantee, despite the fact that throughout urban India we are now seeing more and more youth protest. There are many ways of creatively developing urban employment guarantee programs. Several states are attempting it, but as we know, they have no money. And these can involve skilled labor as well. These, again, will have multiplier effects that will generate more activities widely and so on. So the refusal to contemplate an urban employment program, the refusal to minimally fund the rural program. If you actually were clear that you wanted to provide 100 days of employment to the number of workers who are registered, you would have to provide a minimum of 2.6 lakh crore. And instead, what do we find? It's very clear that the government has no intention of doing this. The other aspects I think are going to be touched. I know Ravi will talk very convincingly about health, but you know, one of the big areas in which we are really depriving a generation is education. We closed our schools the most abruptly, and we have kept them closed the longest. And this in turn has meant that especially first generation learners, children of poorer families, more disadvantaged groups, children in rural areas, far-flung areas, they've had nothing at all. There's been a massive retrogression in learning. Even at the highest levels, we know what this has meant even for students in JNU and students in the elite institutions. This closure, prolonged closure, the inability to provide connectivity of a minimal level, pushing back. Everywhere else in the world, governments have raised education spending to enable countries and young people to recover, to get back some of what they have lost in this 2-year period, everywhere else in the world, including in our neighboring countries like Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. We, on the other hand, during the pandemic year, we cut down on spending because we said, oh, schools are closed, wonderful, we don't have to spend. And even in the subsequent year, we have barely raised it, as Malini showed. So we are really not providing for this massive setback that has already occurred. We're not doing anything to make good on this supposed substitution of digital learning for actual learning, which doesn't exist in any case. But we're not even doing anything to prevent this digital divide. That has huge gender implications. I'm sure Yashodhara will talk about that as well. But girls have been disproportionately deprived, excluded, much more child labor, much more child marriage, all of those things have happened as well. It's a bit like, I don't know how many of you are aware that there was a big advertisement that the PM Rashtriya Sadak Yojana is because national highways have increased by 45,000 kilometers under this Prime Minister. Well, guess how that happened? They renamed 45,000 kilometers of state highways as national highways. So yes, there's a big increase in national highways. This is the kind of thing that's going on even with capital expenditure in the budget, which really means we can't expect growth out of this anyway. And we know that all the supply side measures, all the tax incentives, all the other things that are being offered do not lead to a rise in aggregate private investment. They just enable certain cronies to benefit even more and add to the inequality that we have observed in the country. So maybe we also have to think about the political economy in our country that is even enabling such a process to occur. But let me stop here. Thanks.
Thank you for your excellent inputs, as always, as ever. I'm sure this would have energized all of our participants to think in a much deeper fashion about the budget and all these great claims which are being made. Let me come to now our second panelist, Professor R. Nagaraj. The three suggestions for you, Professor Nagaraj, are if you could include your reflections on these as well. So prevailing macroeconomic challenges, especially that of unemployment, underemployment, inflation, some of it has already been touched by Professor Ghosh, but you could please add your observations on some of these. The budget's provisions support for the manufacturing sector and MSMEs in particular, and its extensive reliance upon supply side measures instead of stepping up fiscal support for labor-intensive sectors like rural development and agriculture. So floor is yours, Professor Nagaraj.
Yeah, thank you, Praveen. I have a prepared presentation on the growth part of it. Then I will take up the questions you have posed towards the end, and if I try to miss it or avoid it, you may please stop me or ask me again. Yes. First of all, I mean, what this slide may sound very irritating to people who are knowledgeable about budgets, but at the risk of annoying people, let me say budgets are annual financial statements of revenues and expenditure, strictly speaking. Okay, budgets are also political and ideological statements. That's very important. Okay, financial analysts and economists look for policy directions and intent, because the numbers, we often take them very seriously, should be taken with a lot of caution. That's right, but they give you a broad direction, which is why we look at these numbers. Fine print matters most in a budget, like in most financial statements. This is very important because very often we people spend enormous time in trying to analyze this budget year to year, revised versus actual. But honestly, I think one has to be very careful with these numbers because they are like the financial statements. Therefore, that's the caution. Yeah, budget presentation and its aftermath is a hype media event, mostly forgotten quickly. This is, I must say this. In fact, recently when I wrote this op-ed piece in the Hindu, and I quoted my statement last year on the same day, and people were surprised and embarrassed that the things have not changed. So I thought it's important to mention. Look, this is a very quickly forgotten event. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What stood out in the budget? I'm just taking the budget on its face value. Okay. Emphasis on public investment-led growth. That's the kind of a big message which comes out of the budget. It is claimed to be a public. Okay. Is it a big deal? The question is, my answer is yes. I thought that's my answer. Not just emphasis in investment, but public investment. That's important. At least the emphasis purely is on paper is public investment. It signals a theoretical shift underlying the budget under the present regime, because earlier on, as we know, the analytical argument was public investment crowds out private investment. Okay, and therefore it is not desirable. The overall investment level may not grow up. Public investment is considered to be less efficient than private investment. Therefore, overall the growth effect is expected to be lower. That's the standard argument of the mainstream economics. But this budget overthrows that idea, or gives up that idea in favor of a potential virtuous cycle of growth in a Keynesian tradition. So theoretically, in this sense, the budget is different. Yeah, next slide, please. Yeah, this is evidence of the official stance. This is I have not analyzed the numbers in detail. This is the first statement, budget at a glance. So here, three figures we have. Budget estimate 2023, 22, 23 over the previous year. You can see the last row. There is a 38.1% rise in capital expenditure, and this is, of course, this number is slightly higher than the number which the finance minister mentioned in the budget speech. There may be a slight difference, but the orders of magnitudes are similar. And this is what is attracted a lot of attention, and which is what the finance minister sought to highlight. Okay, but the overall expenditure, if you look at it, it's just 13.3%, which is not insignificant. This is in current prices, not constant prices. If you net out a 4% in inflation rate, the actual amount will be about 9 to 10%. That's the okay. So budget, nothing new except for the hyped and theoretical narrative. I mean, that's what I say. It's a new narrative. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, this proposed increase has to be seen in the context of what has happened with respect to investment over the last decade. And in this sense, I thought this was a significant statement, because we have seen that between 2011-12 and 1920, these numbers are from the national accounts, there is a massive decline in GFCF, that is gross fixed capital formation, that is fixed capital formation as a ratio of GDP. In fact, if you go back, I think the peak was reached in 2008-9 when it had reached a figure of about 38%. Okay, so if you take from that, we have more than a decade of a secular decline in investment ratio in the economy. I don't think we have ever had a situation after independence where this kind of a decline in investment has happened. So therefore, it's a very serious issue which many of us have been highlighting. But I was happy in a limited sense that at least the government has woken up to this crisis of lack of investment. And again, the composition of investment, there are three institutional sectors: public sector, private corporate sector, household sector. Public investment went up, its share went up between 2011-12 and 15-16 a little bit, and has been coming down. So to claim that this is a major advancement over the last previous years, as the finance minister claimed, I mean, those hyped statement needs to be tempered. In fact, what is being sought to be done is a try to correct marginally the long-term decline, or maybe that's the best one can attribute it to. Next slide, please. Yeah, assessment. I mean, in principle, shift in emphasis in investment-led growth is a welcome to reverse the long-term decline. However, it is opportune moment. Is it the opportune moment to shift? This is the question I ask. Okay, certainly not. Certainly not. And I think this answers the question which Praveen had posed in the beginning. The immediate task is to restore employment, income, and livelihood in the informal sector workers and their families. Why? Because private investment share in GDP has fallen by 3 percentage points over the pre-COVID level. This is a 3 percentage points of GDP, which is a very substantial number in absolute terms. Okay, and this fall doesn't, the proposed increase in fixed investment rate of about 0.5 percentage point does not compensate for the 3 percentage point fall in consumption demand. So therefore, in relation to consumption decline, the proposed investment increase is marginal. That's the point. Okay. Yet, public expenditure on employment-oriented schemes like NREGA would have yielded immediate results. See, instead of spending on public investment, immediate investment on NREGA kind of a scheme, which others have spoken about, would have led to immediate increase in investment on output and unemployment. Okay. Budget's intent is public investment-led growth, but it is fiscal consolidation in spirit. I'm making a very strong statement here. While the headline statement is public investment-led growth, but in reality, it's basically fiscal consolidation. In fact, finance minister in her speech mentioned that they are sticking to the schedule of decline in reduction in fiscal deficit, which was outlined in the previous budget. So as it was shown earlier in one of the slides by Malini, in fact, the proposed fiscal deficit is 4.3% or something, which means the real intent of the intent of the government is fiscal consolidation, and the budget investment is just for headline. Okay, so I don't see much happening in public investment. So I'll just quickly next slide, please. Next slide. Now, as budget's agenda, public investment-led growth is a welcome in principle. I welcome it in principle because many of us have been for years been arguing that look, there's a need for stepping up public investment. So that seems to be finally coming. So on the face of it, one can be elated about it, but in reality, it doesn't seem to be the case. Okay, when you look at closely, its success would depend on the fine print of how the additional resources would be spent. Okay, here I have not looked at in detail. There's a piece in Wire yesterday by S.C. Garg. S.C. Garg was a former finance ministry secretary. I mean, this is where I don't fully understand the budgetary arithmetic or the way it is presented. Maybe some people in the here would be familiar. Okay, so such a shift in emphasis seems premature given the loss of employment and consumption in the informal sector during the years of pandemic. So, in reality, the shift towards public investment-led growth is unlikely to happen and is unlikely to pull the economy out of the low level we have got into in the current year. I stop here, and I think I would like to answer the question which Praveen asked. I think I have answered a little bit. Okay. See, the question asked was the budget's provision support for manufacturing sector and MSMEs. Here, my answer is simple. The budget speech mentioned about the success of PLI scheme. PLI is the production-linked incentives. This is basically subsidy for production, domestic production, and they have introduced it for a large number of industries. One industry where it has taken off substantially is mobile phone assembly. Okay, except that in most of the schemes there is nothing much to show on the ground. Okay, it is just a wishful statement of announcing various schemes, but how many factories or firms have come up, what have they produced, how much foreign exchange they have earned, there's very little information about it. So it will be too premature to claim a success of PLI scheme. Okay, and what we must see is that the industrial growth has fallen from about 13% in 2015-16 to -7% in the last year. So there's again been a steady decline in growth rate over 6 years or so, which again is unprecedented in last 2-3 decades. Okay, so and what the government claims that its investment will boost industrial demand, I am not very hopeful. Okay, so PLI scheme and the public investment-led growth, which looks hypothetical, I'm not sure which is likely to reverse the negative growth or declining growth we have seen in MSME and industrial sector in general over the next year. That is my brief answer. Thank you. I think I'll stop here.
Thank you, Professor Nagaraj, for those very insightful inputs. And you have, apart from reflecting on some of these issues, raised several questions which hopefully the participants will pick up. Thank you. We'll come back to you with the questions. Now we have the next on the panel, Jashodhara Dasgupta, and the two specific issues, Jashodhara, for you. How well does this budget address gender issues that have got aggravated in the wake of the pandemic? And second, how does this budget address the problem of exclusion in the key social sectors like school education, maternal and reproductive health services, among others, which have been hit hard over the last 2 years? These are areas on which you have a special expertise, and hence these issues are being thrown to you. So, Jashodhara, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Praveen. And at the outset, I must say that I'm here representing the Feminist Policy Collective, which held a pre-budget consultation last year in November. And a lot of the points that I will be raising are on behalf of the collective. So just to begin with, I'd like to say that I totally agree with what Professor Jayati Ghosh said about the smoke and mirrors approach. We have been finding that even during the pandemic response, where we felt that all the relief announcements, as Professor Ghosh has already pointed out, they were really not providing relief to anyone. They were extremely insubstantial, and especially for women and other genders. In terms of this budget, I think our overall analysis is that it is one of the most uncaring budgets. And I use the word care advisedly, because we have been told that there is a lot of care to which resources are being devoted. But this is a very uncaring budget. And I will just substantiate that by looking at a few sectors where the budget entirely failed to respond to the situation that women are facing. So one of the things, of course, as we all know, is about the fact that women's work burden has been exacerbated at the same time as the fact that they have been losing jobs and employment. The fact that those who are in care work on an official basis, for example, our frontline women workers, the Ashas and the Anganwadis, they have been undercompensated, underprotected, and have been consistently underpaid, despite the very, very crucial role that they played. The other thing, of course, is that we know that women are in the informal sector. They're working on construction sites as agricultural laborers, as domestic workers, as micro-entrepreneurs, at home-based production, casual workers, and the more than 1 million sex workers. And all of these are those in which they are without formal employment contracts, and many of them are migrants without any kind of documentation. So in this, we found what happened was the kind of food insecurity and the lack of social protection during the pandemic have not been addressed through the budget this year. We know that women are showing frighteningly high levels of anemia, especially among pregnant women, even non-pregnant women and adolescent girls, which have all gone up since the last 5 or 6 years. And the fact that any kind of social protection scheme is only for those who are documented or have ration cards, and almost 90 million vulnerable members of our population do not have ration cards. Within that, we also know that violence was something that really has increased. The number of women, for example, in the National Family Health Survey has shown to have more than doubled who have faced spousal violence. And of course, during the pandemic, this has been widely discussed, the fact that women, girls, and those from non-conforming gender or sexual preferences have faced a high level of domestic violence with an inability to access support. And within that, of course, comes the question of the digital divide, because it has been assumed by our government that having mobile phones and access to the internet is the answer to all problems. And of course, we know that about half the numbers of Indian women use mobile internet as compared to men. And women's health has also been severely affected. We have found almost a half decline in the numbers of women who are able to access institutional childbirth, who are able to access the life-saving cesarean sections. We estimate that there were almost 1.5 million abortions, of which more than half would have been unsafe abortions. The lack of contraception has resulted in unintended pregnancies. But what have been the budgetary provisions to address this crisis? And I think we were really hoping that there would be a gender transformative response to the budget and a form of a feminist policy response. But within that, we have been really disappointed to see that, for example, the gender budgeting for itself is really low. It is a very, very small part within a thing called Samarthya, in which so many schemes have been lumped, and hardly 500 crore has been given for that. We know that data discrepancies have been a major issue in order to understand the impacts, differential impacts on gender. And we also know that the allocations for the Ministry of Women and Child have actually not even increased substantially if we look at inflation. And the total of the gender budget allocation, unfortunately, remains at 4.3% of the overall budget. We know that the social protection nets, which are so essential for women who are in informal employment, have been weakened. For example, the food subsidy allocation and the schemes for supplementary nutrition within the Saksham Anganwadi, all of these have actually been reduced if we adjust for 5% inflation. They've reduced from the last year. We are looking at high anemia and malnutrition among adolescent girls. But the allocation for midday meals, which has now been given a shiny new name, has again been reduced from 11,500 to 10,200 crores. Subsidies for cooking fuel have been slashed, and the LPG for poor households budgets have been halved. The social security pensions are extremely low, which lead to about 200 rupees per month per pensioner. And the COVID relief package has not been extended for this year. So we find that the critical benefit for maternity for women has been given absolutely no attention. We estimate that about 8,000 crores would be the minimum outlay within a 60-40 ratio in order to provide universal unconditional maternity allowance. But all of this has been subsumed under something called Samarthya, which has a total budget of 2,622 crores. So it is severely under budgeted, and clearly there is no political intention of ensuring women's maternity protection during pregnancy and lactation. As other speakers have pointed out, the emphasis on capital expenditure, and I think Professor Nagaraj has really clearly shown this, that it is really not going to lead to employment generation, especially for women who are mostly in contractual workers within the construction sector. The credit that's been given is not what women need. They need support with digital skilling, with new ways of livelihood generation. They needed more budgets for Manrega. That has not been given. They needed the working days to be raised to 200. Urban schemes announced. That has not happened. Women farmers have not been recognized. There are no policy directions for registering women farmers and the unregistered women workers. And of course, we finally will always emphasize that the millions of women who are being forced to work as volunteers are not being regularized or given fair wages. In fact, it is ironic that the only thing in the budget that mentions them is their life insurance in case of death by COVID. And that too, the budget has been reduced to almost 1/4. Their care work, which was exacerbated during the COVID pandemic time, has not been recognized with any kind of cash transfer. In terms of gender-based violence, we actually were quite excited that there would be some emphasis on mental health. But we find the NIMHAN's budget has barely been increased, and the allocations for Nirbhaya Fund and for all the schemes within Sambal remain at a really paltry sum of around 1,400 crores overall. It's only the thing that has gone up is the one which is within the Safe Cities project, because that's directly under the Department of Home Affairs, and it has really been increased almost 4 times. The schemes for the safety of women in the public transport and roads have been slashed to about 1/5. And the overall allocations for women and the violence, the programs on violence, needed to be at least 11,000 crores. And these paltry sums are really not going to address the problem. The health budget, I'm sure Ravi will be talking more about that. We find that it's really a minuscule percentage of the total budget. The emphasis has been so much on digital health. And it's interesting how the outlay for the National Digital Health Mission has shot up from being 30 crores last year to 200 crores. And we want to know whether the government is interested in putting out health cards or improving health care. Because the budget for the National Health Mission, which addresses most of the gendered needs of women and girls, has actually not been raised at all. In fact, it's actually coming down as a proportion of the health budget. So the budget for COVID response, the irony is that it is entirely being taken out because it's considered that COVID is no longer an issue. And yet, the budgets for the health coverage under the Pradhan Mantri, the PMJAY, has despite not functioning effectively, despite not meeting women's needs at all during the pandemic, has actually been kept at the same level of 6,400 crores, even though the revised estimate last year was about half of that, because clearly the money was not being spent because it failed to actually address the health needs of the population. So it's ironic what the emphasis has remained on and what has been really neglected. And I think overall, we as the Feminist Policy Collective continue to be very disappointed at the way the private sector role has been enhanced, including within the PMJY, the way that we are sure the National Digital Health Mission will lead to health data going into private hands, and the fact that there has not been any attention given to the safety and protection of women. So to end with, I think we really hope that the budget discussions over the next few weeks can lead to some amount of recalibration. And we really hope that our parliamentarians will ensure that the kind of budget that's really needed for women to recover and contribute better to the progress of the country will actually be brought about. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Jasodhara, very much for these very, very powerful insights and remarks on the budget. Let's go to Ravi now, Ravi Duggal. Ravi, two specific suggestions for you, apart from whatever else you want to discuss, are this budget's priority for the health sector and other social sectors like education, water, and sanitation, and two, priorities for scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and other disadvantaged sections of the population. So if you could integrate these in your reflections. Ravi, floor is yours, please.
Thanks, Praveen, and thanks, CBGA, for having me on this panel. We've had a lot of interesting ideas and insights coming from the earlier panelists like Jayati, Nagaraj, and Jashodhara. So if you look at the overall kind of scenario in which this budget is placed, and you see, as others have pointed out, a huge increase in capital expenditure. But what is this capital expenditure for? The whole Gati Shakti thing that the budget talks about, the finance minister was emphasizing. This is diverting public resources towards a kind of private profiteering, because all these resources, capital expenditure resources of building highways, etc., will ultimately feed into the process of infrastructure development, which will be through the private sector. So, and where does this money come from? If you look at the overall budget, huge cuts in welfare spending. I mean, right from food subsidy and subsidy for LPG, gas, or fertilizers, and food. Huge kind of cuts you see there, as well as various welfare programs and activity. Just to give you an overall sense of where the social services sector stands. I mean, last year, the social services got 5.89% of the total budget. This year it's down to 5.42. And sectors which have been hit hard are health, which is down from 2.25% of the budget to from 2.33% last year. Food subsidy 5.24% from 7.93% last year. Rural development 3.42% from 5.58% last year. Rural employment, that's Narega, 1.85% of the budget from 3.16% last year, and overall subsidies from a huge 21.6% in the previous year to down to 8.99%. So this is the kind of welfare cuts that we see. So a clear movement of the budget in favor of capital, and kind of moving away from labor and other kind of investments that would help employment, generate employment and jobs and incomes and consumption of people. So that is in that context, I would now move on to the health budgets specifically. But before that, I mean, since Praveen asked about what happens to the vulnerable sections like the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, so there is a separate allocation for that. I mean, a certain proportion of the budget of each ministry is allocated towards the SC component and the ST component, which was earlier called that. Now it's called welfare of SCs and welfare of STs, like the gender budget. So there also you see huge hits in terms of declines in food, health, agriculture, employment. So all these, especially the SCs and STs who are highly dependent on NREGA, will be drastically affected because of the decline in the budget for NREGA, or even in the health sector and the food subsidy that we see. So now moving to health specifically, we have seen a decline in health expenditure from 2.33% last year to 2.25% this year of the total budget, and this is about, in terms of GDP, it's a decline from 0.37% last year to 0.31% of GDP this year. So overall, you see much less being kind of committed to healthcare, despite the big talk of the government that we have huge income growth, huge buoyancy in taxes, especially GST, to which the poor contribute much more as a share of their income, but nothing comes to them in any significant way in terms of increasing allocations to improve their access to public goods, which the state is supposed to provide through the budget. That we don't see happening very clearly. Specifically if you look at the National Health Mission, which is the main flagship program in the health sector, we find in the last 4 to 5 years, there's been a declining trend. I mean, from a peak of 58%, 58.56% of health budget, NHM share is now down to 39.19% in 21-22, and 22-23 is projected at about 42% of the total health budget. So that is an important core program of primary health care, and which caters to communicable diseases, non-communicable disease, basic primary care, maternal health, antenatal care, immunization, child immunization. All these have seen significant drops. And during the COVID years, I mean, since 2021 onwards, when you look at the health management information system of the health department, you find huge declines in routine access to routine care, seeking immunizations, TB treatment, and identification of cases, etc. Many of the programs which are under NHM actually have seen declining access, and that is due to the decline in budgets at one level, and secondly, when the COVID crisis happened, the healthcare started firefighting, and healthcare sector started firefighting to deal with COVID and ignored the routine healthcare that people need access to from time to time. Then, as I think Jashodhra already pointed out, I mean that 2-3 programs within the health sector. So what the loss of NHM is the gain of tertiary care sector within the public health system, and the 2 programs, the Pradhan Mantri Swasthya Suraksha Yojana, which has seen an increase from 7,000 crores in the previous year to 10,000 crores, which basically targets setting up new tertiary care facilities like AIIMS kind of hospitals in states, or upgrading existing government hospitals to the level of AIIMS type of hospital. And then there's this Pradhan Mantri, the Abhim program, the Ayushman Bharat Health Infrastructure Mission, which is more focused at the district level to upgrade the health infrastructure within the district from the primary health center level to fine, we need this kind, and that's seen a huge increase from 900 crores to 5,156 crores. We definitely need this kind of expenditure, but it can't be at the cost of reducing investments in the National Health Mission, which constitutes the core primary healthcare programs. And the problem with the PMSSY and the PM Abhim program, which has got so many resources, is there's a likelihood that if they follow the diktat of the Niti Aayog, that all kind of upgradation of teaching hospitals, tertiary care hospitals, and district hospitals must be through the PPP mode, or worse still, handing over to the private sector. I think it defeats the purpose, and it will not help to serve the cause of improved access to healthcare, even if these facilities get that investment. So I think that's a caution that we need to keep in mind vis-a-vis these programs. And similarly, there's the PMJAY scheme, which Jashodhra has already talked about, and which they do allocate 6,400 crores every year, but they'll end up spending less than half the amount. And whatever is spent, the premiums which are paid and the reimbursements which are given, 75% of that is diverted to the private sector, so, and largely the corporate private sector, like Apollo's and Escort and so on. So basically, this is a subsidy to the PMJAY, is a subsidy to the private sector, and I don't see any reason why it should continue. It needs to be scrapped, and that money instead should be invested in strengthening district hospitals so that people get care closer, tertiary care closer to them available within the districts and the blocks. So investment should happen there, and not in these tertiary through this PMJAY mode, where resources go largely to the private sector, which is located in metropolitan cities where people find it difficult to access. So it's I think it's a useless program which we need to discontinue and stop wasting public resources towards that end. And if we look at the National Health Policy statement, the 2017 health policy, we talk about 2.5 to 3% of GDP to be allocated to health, and within which the share of the union government should be around 40%. So if it's 2.5% of GDP, then 1% of GDP should be what the union government should be allocating to the health sector, which means the entire health budget of the country today should be actually borne by the union government, and the balance 1.5% of GDP by the state government. So that's a huge task, and unless they actually make these resource commitments, I mean, we've been hearing this figure of 2.5% of GDP since the 1982 National Health Policy, and subsequent policies also have kept this figure, but we don't see any progress. And even this 2017 policy talks about reaching this target by 2024-25, but at this pace of budgetary allocations, I don't think we're going to get. They will remain around 1% of GDP, and even within this kind of healthcare, the public health system, there's huge segmentation. So our members of parliament and the bureaucracy get CGHS, on which the government is spending 13,000 rupees per capita, in sharp contrast to the general health budget being merely 16 to 1700 rupees per capita. So this is the kind of discrimination, I mean, which we see within the public health system. So why such high level of resources for people who get fat salaries, fat pensions, etc., but the poor do not get access to this kind of healthcare? So the segmentation approach, if that remains, we don't shift to comprehensive primary healthcare, we will not be able to, and this can only happen if we actually increase substantially allocations. Finally, about the COVID related spending, we see that in the 2021-22 budget, that's actual expenditure, within the health, from the health department, 11,940 crores was spent on COVID care. Some bit of it for vaccination, but largely for upgrading, providing those temporary kind of infrastructure required to set up hospital beds, etc., ICU units, oxygen concentrators, etc. In 21-22, it shot up to 16,545 crores. And a lot of this was vaccination related expenditure. And within the health budget, the allocation for 22-23 is only 226 crores. It's drastically down, and that too for just one line item, which is the cover for health insurance, cover for insurance of health workers in case they die in the line of duty. So this is what the COVID-related expenditure is. Then there's a separate allocation for, I'm just ending. The separate allocation for vaccination, which was up in the revised estimate to 39,000 crores. But it is now down to 5,000 crores, as though we have completed the vaccination cycle. No, we've still covered only about 65% of adults who are fully vaccinated. So, and a recent RTI revealed that up to December 20th, 2021, the expenditure on vaccinations was only 19,675 crores. So out of the 35,000 or 39,000 which was allocated, this is what has been spent, which covers about 160 crore doses. And nothing we know about the PM CARES, and which is sitting on a lot of money unaccounted, and we don't know what is happening to that. So that needs to be questioned. And to conclude, I think we need immediately to, the budget should be looking at increasing allocation to 2.5% of GDP so that we can build a robust primary healthcare system. So I'll stop at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ravi, for all those extremely important reflections. Now, since Professor Ghosh has to leave very soon because of an urgent commitment, so we'll take a few specific questions which are to her. These are the three selected questions that I have got from the CBGA team. The questions are, number one, there has been a lot of focus on giving tax concessions to corporates with the assumption that it would boost investment from them. But is that at all a good fiscal strategy, given that there is a recession going on, instead of boosting direct public investment on economic sectors? Number two, what according to you is the reason behind increase in tax collection? Do you think that this can be sustained at all? Another question, we have seen an increase in social welfare expenditure all over the big economies globally, but why is it not the case in India? It's just the opposite in India. How can this be linked with the current fiscal strategy of the government? And there's a question which is open to all the panelists, to which Professor Ghosh can also respond. Many times the government provides additional resources in supplementary budgets. Do you think this may happen this year too, especially for Narega? Professor Ghosh.
Yeah, thank you so much for these questions, and apologies that I have to leave slightly earlier than planned. So the tax concessions to corporates, this was of course something that in 2019 when it was done, many of us had pointed out that there is really no evidence to suggest that this works in terms of encouraging more private investment. And it was very, very evident that it didn't, to the point where Nirmala Sitharaman herself the following year said that said in a meeting of, I think, FICCI or CII or something, that, we gave you all these concessions and what have we got in return? You didn't invest more. So it doesn't actually assist growth necessarily. What assists growth is a booming economy, is a dynamic market, is the fact that there are people who have purchasing power who are willing to spend it. And then investment occurs because then they can see that there's a prospect of increasing sales and so on. So it's absolutely the wrong way to go. It's never worked in any place. That the government still thinks that all of these measures and incentives, which are fiscally very expensive. Remember that particular tax concession in 2019 cost nearly 2% of GDP. I think 1.8% of GDP is what the fiscal cost was. Imagine that is 6 times, more than 6 times what the government is spending on health. It is, again, more than 7 times what it's spending on Narega and so on and so forth. So yeah, the fiscal cost is immense and it gives you no benefits. It just enriches those who are already rich. The increase in tax collection, I think Malini already pointed out some of the important reasons for this. One is the fact that this is really a period where certain segments of the corporate sector have benefited hugely, not all. So we find that MSMEs have been crying, collapsing, they're hurting very badly. We find that the smaller corporates are not doing particularly well either, but certain large corporates, and I would repeat, it's not even all large corporates, certain large corporates have benefited hugely from differential treatment, from preferential policies, from various deregulatory and other practices that have enabled them to profit off the pandemic. And so when you look at the increase in those profits, it's not as if the tax revenues have even kept pace with that increase. So I think there was a study done by an Indian Economy Lab. They came out with an estimate which related only to the first 6 months of this fiscal year, which showed that if you look at that increase in the profits, it's not matched by the increase in corporate tax. So yes, corporate taxes are increasing, but profits are increasing even faster for the privileged companies. And of course, the other big reason for increased tax revenues is the oil charges. The government has disproportionately levied very huge charges, taxes and duties on the price of fuel at a time when global prices were low, and even when they were rising, they did not reduce them to any significant extent. And this has been a very important source of revenue. Remember, this is not shared with the states, and other cesses and surcharges that they have imposed have not been shared with the states either. So this is really the 2 major reasons for the increase in tax collection. Such little increase in the most basic social protections, in health spending, in education spending, in in food allocations. I mean, that was really all just getting rid of the debt of the Food Corporation of India. There was no fresh additional allocation to ensure that you got food to everyone who needed it. And this cynicism and lack of minimal spending, and including on the employment guarantee program, why is it doing it? I don't understand the minds of these governments, but a very important reason for how it is doing it is because it can. Because for some amazing reason, there isn't enough outcry. There isn't enough social and political mobilization to make sure that the government cannot cut these spendings, that they have to not just ring fence, but expand this kind of expenditure. To me, it's a political question, and it's one that I'm still grappling with. Because really, if someone had asked me 10 years ago, can this happen? I would have said, no, in India it can't, that the roots of democracy are too deep. But unfortunately, that is not the case. We are seeing that there is widespread acceptance and very little protest and very little response. The government is not going to change policy because it suddenly sees the light or because it listens to some, well-meaning advices. They're going to change because they have to. And they will only have to when there is sufficient public demand for this. To the law, the Rural Employment Guarantee Act specifies that you have to provide the employment, that you can't say, I don't have money. The law says the government is duty bound to provide funds. If it actually obeyed the law, it would have provided much more initially in the budget. It would have immediately provided supplementary grants whenever it needs. It can do that. Historically, governments have, and in fact, even this government, as I mentioned in December, asked for 25,000 crore more, which is still less than is required. It should be automatic. It should be that whenever there is anywhere near, you're getting close to 80% of funds being spent, you have to provide more resources. They have not been doing this. Will this happen this year? Will this happen as a matter of course? No. It will only happen if there's really sufficiently major and loud public demand for this. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Subrat, do you want to add a special word of thanks to Professor Ghosh's contributions, because she has to leave now?
No, certainly. It's very early in the morning for Professor Ghosh, and we are really grateful, ma'am. We are really grateful for your guidance and your support to all of us at CBGA. So thank you so much for joining this program.
Over 2 decades.
It's always a pleasure. It's always a pleasure to be part of CBGA.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
Thanks very much. Thanks. So, okay. Bye. Okay. Now we come to our other questions to other panelists. But before I forget, because this was a very important issue, this NREGA. See, everyone knows that it is demand driven. So if, legally, if there is additional demand for it, by law, the government is supposed to meet that demand, right? So, let's keep that in mind. And what actually is happening, again, many of you know it, but just to put it very clearly, in fact, in many states, wages for NREGA are below the minimum wages, right? In a context where we have seen the kind of very, very difficult situation, it must be taken note of. But let me keep some of my responses for towards the end, and let me go to some of the questions which our participants have put to our esteemed panelists. So, starting with Professor Nagaraj, there have been talk of changes in custom duty to encourage domestic manufacturing. How do you see this in terms of its implication on the resource mobilization front? So, changes in customs duty to encourage domestic manufacturing, and how do you see this in terms of implication on resource mobilization front? Then we have, there was this open question, which you can also reflect on. Many times government provide additional resources, supplementary budgets, and so on. So do you think it might happen for some schemes, especially for NREGA? The other question specific to you is, how effective will be the supply side policies of the union government, like the deregulation of numerous sectors and removal of retrospective tax in August 2021? How will that prove in the long run? So that is the other question. One more. There has been, this is basically repeating the same question on the custom duty to encourage domestic manufacturing. It has been put here twice. Okay, so these are the specific questions for you, Professor Nagaraj. And you can add any further reflections which you think are important to this conversation. Please.
Thank you. Thank you, Praveen. You can hear me? Yeah, okay. Yeah. First is the customs duty. This basically increases increasing tariff, which means that it is going to provide that much protection to domestic production to the extent of the taxes. So it is a protectionistic step. So it's basically will make domestic manufacturing more profitable compared to imports. Whether it is desirable, see, this is where we go to basic infant industry argument. Whether this is should we have this kind of protection? So I think if it is for a specified period of time, not for infinitely. It might have a positive effect, provided other things are done. See, customs protection, or basically tariff protection, is a temporary measure. If you believe that we are in an open market or a free market economy, it is a temporary protection, and it is to help domestic manufacturing to pick up productivity which is comparable to our competitors in the global market. This can happen provided other complementary investments are made domestically. If during the period of protection, if domestic manufacturers step up their investments, and if the state provides them necessary help to come up to international competitive level in terms of infrastructure, etc., this might enable domestic manufacturing to be able to become competitive internationally. If not, this may remain a temporary palliative, and if the customs duty is reduced after a few years, then we may go back to the old level. So this may not have any long-term effect. So whether customs really help the domestic manufacturing sector or not depends upon complementary investments made by the state, complementary support provided by the state, and the investments made by the firms. So this is where we require not just customs protection, but an overall package of industrial policy. So this is what many of us who have been arguing, that Indian industry has been doing pretty badly. India has become an import-dependent economy on China. Even after last year, yeah, we had a Atmanirbhar Bharat program, but after that, in fact, our imports from China have increased, and therefore we are no more Atmanirbhar. In fact, beyond the slogans, we have nothing to show. This is where I think customs duty alone may not be helpful. We require a reimagined industrial policy to see that we on a path of improved production and productivity, so that we can compete globally. So unless that is done, this may remain a very temporary palliative. That's the first answer. Then supplementary budgets are often taken. And as Praveen rightly mentioned, NREGA is a demand-driven. It's by law the state is supposed to provide. But how much state really does is a different question. And in fact, numbers show that there's a huge backlog of NREGA payments. So therefore, the government has not been following the law. So therefore, the government can and should use supplementary budgets to take care of the additional expenditure to be made under NREGA and other schemes. Okay, effective supply side. Yes, in fact, in the last 5-6 years, in fact, this government has been systematically arguing in favor of supply side economics. In fact, arguing, look, if supply improves, the growth will happen because demand. But we know that things have not improved. If anything, supply side has increased supply of imported goods, but domestic production has not picked up. Okay, and we have become an import-dependent economy, and domestic production growth rates have been fallen, as I've argued earlier. So supply side alone will not help. Okay, this is where I think we require demand side policy. At least this budget, at least purely theoretically, I was happy that they said, look, the demand side is a problem, and investment demand is a big problem. So at least I was purely, in terms of arguments, I thought I was happy with the argument, but it may not have much substance. That's a different matter. Okay, and retrospective tax, I think, I don't know the details, but I think that is a mess which the previous government had created. To be fair, I think certain finance ministers had gone in for. See, if you believe in a free open market, you must play by the global rules. If you don't play and try to change rules retrospectively, this is bound to face international backlash, which is exactly what happened. So I think we are paying for the sins of the previous government, and the government thought they can wriggle out of it, but the international court systems have been very, very rigorous, and they have punished India for this. And I think it's good that they get out of it if they want to be part of the global, system of global legal system. So I think we have no choice but to accept it and move on to develop capabilities so that you can face, competitive challenges in future. That's all I got to say. I think I'll stop.
Okay, no, but there are after the first round, there were two other questions which came to me. So let me just mention these. What is your take on the introduction and future of digital currency and 30% taxation on digital assets? Number one. Two, what kind of policy support should be given by the government to spur private sector investment in manufacturing sector that leads to more jobs being created? And maybe one more, the government has been showcasing the rising GST revenue collections over the last few months, but several state governments have been questioning the design and implementation of GST. Your take on these? Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Praveen. See, honestly, I would skip the question on digital currency. I'm quite illiterate about it. I'm quite ignorant about it. I don't understand. I have not followed it. So I would avoid answering the question. Okay. Yes. What kind of specific policies for labor intensive? I think small scale industry or MSME are crying for help. In fact, I have sorry for self promotion. We have just come out with a book on small scale industries or MSMEs, published by Cambridge University Press, which was released last week. We have very detailed 10 case studies across the country where we find that the state support for small industries has frozen in the pre-reform period. Though there have been changes in nomenclature, the state support for small industry or small manufacturing industries have frozen. And so therefore, unless there is a clearly specified state support, both in terms of physical infrastructure, what about the last mile connectivity, last mile, and also a lot of this help has to be done at the local level, at the state and the municipal level, not sitting in Delhi. And therefore, in fact, our case studies are very interesting. Wherever there is a state intervention positively, okay, and the small industry have revived and have prospered, whereas where they have not been, things have been languishing. And there's a very clear comparative study comes out of the studies. So I would say, here again, it ties in with what I said earlier, we require a well articulated, well imagined industrial policy. It need not be the early kind of a command and control we have had. We can be much more market friendly, market enabling industrial policy, so that we avoid the mistakes of the past kind where command and control. So I think it's still possible, like many other East Asian countries have done. There's a lot to learn from the East Asian countries. We can do that. But one should be willing to think about a reimagined industrial policy, which I'm afraid there is not enough thinking about it. Yeah, that would be my take on this. The GST, yes, I think as Jayanti mentioned, as all of us know, see, the GST has increased because government has increased taxes on petrol. This is the most rigorous at a time during last year when the economy was shrinking. The government took away resources from the economy to meet fiscal deficit. I mean, basically, by taxing petrol when the prices were low, the government was draining away purchasing power from the economy to meet the fiscal deficit, which is the most regressive attempt at a time when purchasing power was in short supply. So obviously this hurt in the economy. Therefore, the economy has hardly grown. We have had 2 years of practically zero growth. Okay. Therefore, the 9.2% which is being talked about is basically a misnomer, because the previous it's basically year-on-year growth, which is wrong. If you compare the growth rate to the pre-pandemic period, we have had 2 years of zero growth. So we have 2 years of complete lack of growth, and which means in per capita terms, India is poorer than what it was the pre-pandemic year. And at that time, GST was used, which is completely regressive. Okay, they should not have used it. And that too, there's a problem of sharing with the state, which other speakers have mentioned. So I stop here, Ryan. I stop.
Thank you very much. Very, very important reflections. Now we go to our two other panelists. Jashodhara, a very specific question for you is, can you comment a little on allocations for adolescent girls in light of the specific challenges they are facing during the pandemic? Ravi, for you, very specific questions are, last time health budget was presented, including the budget for WASH, nutrition, finance, commission, grants, etc. Does this year budget include all these sectors have been increased from the last year budget as share of GDP? And the other question for you, specific one, around 55% of construction workers' welfare funds remain unspent. Please comment on why cesses collected is not being spent. How will this impact the migrant and construction workers' well-being? Yes, so let's have your responses. And then in addition to that, the other open questions which were there, if you want to respond to any of those. Jashodhara and then Ravi, please.
Thank you very much, Praveen. I'll just briefly refer to the question on adolescent girls. So the scheme for adolescent girls is actually subsumed once again under the Saksham Anganwadi and the umbrella ICDS. And this actually has been sort of contested also by those who are part of the Anganwadi services, saying that the Saksham Anganwadi, in which the finance minister kind of announced all these so-called smart and environmentally friendly Anganwadi kendras, they felt that there is actually lack of basic amenities in most of the Anganwadi centers today. For example, piped water, toilets, and proper electricity and so on. With the lack of these basic facilities, these grandiose announcements of the Anganwadis, which are going to be eco-friendly and sort of smart and digitally connected, it's just a pipe dream. So there is this big pipe dream, and all of this is within the budget which is for the Saksham Anganwadi, which also includes the budget for the adolescent girls. So I think we are really concerned that the schemes for adolescent girls, for example, for their nutrition and for their education, like there used to be the Sabla scheme, which was also for their non-formal education, all of these are really going to suffer, because when you have a big budget in which many small schemes are included, obviously the government will decide where the allocations will, where the spending will actually happen without full accountability. We also find that other schemes for adolescent girls, for example, in the domain of education, it's extremely wanting. Although a few of the scholarship schemes have seen attention, but overall it's extremely wanting, because there has been an enormous disadvantage faced by adolescent girls who are especially in the middle and high school because of their lack of digital access, and also because of the absence of internet access in so many parts of the country. And these girls have all got disadvantaged because within households, the tendency is, when there are fewer devices, is that the male child always gets preference. As we find with women's access to the internet being half of that of men, we found the same that has been happening among girls and boys within the household. So, of course, most of the households don't have multiple handheld devices in which classes can be attended, and girls have really fallen back. Private tuitions have been the way to go for many families, given 2 years of school closure. And within private tuitions as well, as with private education, the investments are always in favor of the male children. So I think the budget really fails to address this deep gendered crisis in the education and also in the nutrition and well-being of adolescent girls. And the cut in the midday meal budgets, I think, is the cruelest cut of all, because it is actually going to impact on child nutrition. Giving it a shiny new name with Pradhan Mantri is not going to help. I'd just like to speak very briefly to the question on the Building and Construction Workers Fund. I just want to remind the person who asked the question that 2 years ago, the Supreme Court had given an order saying that the boards must spend the monies that have been collected for the welfare of building and construction workers. It was a case in the Supreme Court because it was just not being spent on the social security and other benefits of the workers. The Supreme Court gave this order just after that the COVID pandemic happened, and suddenly the government, as part of its relief package, announced that this money was now going to be spent for the welfare of workers. So this is what I mean by smoke and mirrors. Already there was a Supreme Court order. Suddenly the government announced it as part of a relief package, which meant that there was no extra investment at all on behalf of the government. Today, the Hindu is reporting the fact that that cess that has been collected in the name of workers and which includes contributions by workers has still not been spent. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jasodhara. Ravi, please. Your sharp, short responses.
Yeah, the question about WASH being included as part of the health budget last year was a jumla, and they have realized that and they have not repeated that blunder in this budget. So, because they were budgets of different ministries, nutrition and water and sanitation, etc. I'm sure the ministries may have objected to it also. The cess question, Jashodhara has broadly answered, but I'd just like to add to that there's a lot of workers' funds which are there in social security, different social security funds, like in health specifically, it's the ESIS fund. Now, the new social security code does kind of talk about bringing in the informal sector, because ESIC right now covers only the formal sector. And that too not the entire formal sector, because it's not universal. It is kind of demarcated by a certain income ceiling. So if you're above that, you are no longer covered. So I think there's a huge amount of money. The ESIC has free reserves of 1,20,000 crores. Similarly, the construction workers funds, there are about 35,000 crores. And the government is not spending it. And then when the pandemic happened, they kind of misused those funds. I would say there are misuse of funds because these are workers' funds for their regular social security, not for crisis management. So this is what is happening. ESIC funds have also been misused that way. I mean, because they have started these medical colleges, which is not the mandate of social security, and so on. I have another issue to flag, and which probably Praveen can respond to this, because if you look at the budget, it's shameful that as much as 89% of total revenues which are collected are raised but unrealized, what the government calls. Basically, I would call them uncollected revenues. It's huge, 89%, which means we can actually double the tax GDP ratio if we can collect all that. And most of it must be from the corporate sector, from the large corporate sector who are defaulting on paying taxes. So I think this is some important question. Apart from that, about 5 lakh crores almost is the revenues foregone. So this is huge corporate subsidies, which I think we need to question and raise that. Maybe, I know, Praveen, what is your take on that? But yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Ravi. Subrat, it's already the closing time. Do you permit us another 5 minutes, or should we stop here?
No, certainly, sir. We can.
Because a couple of additional questions have also come.
No, definitely.
And both these are for Jasodhara.
And so one request, I mean, after Jashodhara responds to these questions, if you would allow me a minute to respond to Ravi's point on tax areas here.
All right. No. So let me then go with you first, and then I'll come to these questions. Okay. And then I'll also have something to say in the closing remarks on that. But please, you go ahead, Subrat.
Can you just share the question so that I just can look up any figures if needed? Yeah.
Nilachal, can you please share the questions with Jasodhara, the two last questions?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, please do that. Yes. Okay. So Subrat.
So I mean, obviously, CBGA and I personally, we have been advocating for a significant increase in India's tax GDP ratio, and it should depend a lot more on direct taxes. So there is no doubt about it. But these two issues, revenue foregone because of tax incentives, and more importantly, the issue of tax arrears, there is a need for more clarity about these issues. When it comes to the question of tax revenue foregone because of incentives, the number that we used to get in the publications, budget publications, that number indeed was not based on a very sound methodology. So we had looked at the revenue foregone calculations in other countries, and our own understanding in CBGA was that the government of India should have given a range, a band, that if you withdraw the incentives, then the additional revenue collected would be in the range of, say, 4% of GDP to 6% of GDP, something like that. Instead of that, they were reporting the upper limit of that band. And that calculation was based on very strong assumptions. So methodologically, there were issues. And when the advocacy from the civil society gathered a lot of momentum around tax revenue foregone, what happened was, I think the government simply changed the methodology, and they reported a drastic decline in the revenue foregone amount. So what I'm saying is, our own advocacy on the revenue foregone has to be better informed. And secondly, the issue of tax arrears is problematic. We at CBGA have looked into it closely. So Ravi, the problem with the huge amount reported as tax arrears, I mean, trust me, if it was possible to collect even 50% of that amount, this government would have collected it. They need money to spend on a few things, and I don't think this government would have shied away from collecting tax arrears. The problem is with, again, the way the tax arrear amount is calculated. A significant part of that is kind of affected by litigation. Yes. So what happens is, as the amount involved is kind of, say for instance, suppose suppose the income tax authorities levy a certain amount of tax. I mean, they impose a tax on me, and I'm challenging it. I'm not paying the tax. Then they will keep on adding the interest and the penalty on it until it gets decided. And maybe after 10 years, the decision might go in my favor. So then the entire amount has to be deducted. So what we have discovered is that the tax arrear amount which is reported in the budget documents is very high, but a small part of it can actually be recovered. And some people have said it off the record that some such things were also created deliberately by corrupt income tax officials to harass people. So I just wanted to, because it's we at CBGA we feel it's our responsibility to kind of bring more technical clarity into our work. That's why I just felt tempted to intervene on this.
Thank you, Subrat. No, this was very important, and I think further conversation on this between Subrat, Ravi, and me will be in the CBGA office sometime very soon. So let's, because we don't have too much time, so let's keep that on hold, Ravi, if that's okay with you. Jasodhara, you have already seen the questions, so yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. So the first question was actually about the gender responsive budgeting and how that could be strengthened. And the second question was about the strikes of and the struggles of the frontline workers, the ASHA and Anganwadi workers. So about the first question, which is talking about gender responsive budgeting, I think I've already mentioned that actually the budget is only less than 5% of the overall thing. But what we find is really very funny. Actually, it's just funny if it wasn't so tragic, is that the main challenge with gender budgeting is to find gender disaggregated data from all the departments. Right now, only 5 departments actually put out proper gender budgeting statements. They do the maximum of it. So when we look at gender disaggregated data, the funny thing is there was a national program for improving statistics in India, which would have actually generated more reliable data. for instance, for the informal sector, for different communities, and provided some kind of intersectional understanding. The budget last year was 28 crores. The revised estimate shows that nothing of that was used. And the budget for this year, guess what, is 1 lakh. So obviously the interest in actually strengthening how we gather data and improve a disaggregated approach towards intersectional understanding is just not happening. The second question about the frontline workers, I think it has been a shame that since they have been appointed decades ago, these workers have not seen a career path. They have not seen any further skilling or promotion or any kind of pay grade increase. They have been considered as volunteers just because they happen to be women who are working within communities and therefore are supposed to be, just like they are altruistic within the household, they're supposed to be altruistic in the community. And it's high time that they were recognized as workers. This would actually enhance female workforce participation, to make them formal workers, to provide them with social security, and to ensure that their wages are at least on parallel with the minimum wages. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yashodhara. I think we can't take too much liberty with time. So I'll just take a minute or so. Subrat, with your permission, I think one point which we really need to emphasize is a terrible macroeconomic context for several years now. Even before the pandemic, if you go by the NSS consumption surveys, the one which the government never really kind of officially acknowledged and so on. So between 11-12 and 17-18, we saw that in rural India, per capita consumption for the country as a whole in rural India went down by a whooping 9 percentage points. Now, so a number of things had happened and all of us know it, right? And subsequently, things have, as per all the recent surveys, in a macroeconomic sense, have been indeed very difficult. And especially on consumption, income, etc., that is largely what we describe as the demand side, things have been very troublesome. Yeah, one survey tells you that 84% of the total population, their consumption, income, etc., has declined. Yeah, another survey tells you that the bottom quintile, 20%, the decline in their income is almost 53% or so. All of you have seen this survey, so I'm not wasting your time in mentioning all the relevant details, etc. So there is that huge sort of challenge which should have been acknowledged. Possibly, at least some note should have been taken of that in the context of framing this budget and moving forward, etc. So that is something which, it was already hinted by both Professor Nagaraj and Professor Ghosh in terms of the challenges on that side, the demand side. But I think this is something which is absolutely unprecedented in the last 75 years or so. Yeah, over a quinquennium and more, some 6, 7, 8 years, if you have that kind of challenge, it's basically an emergency, right? An economic emergency. What do we do about it? So I think a lot of thinking is required. And of course, it cannot be simply a matter of one budget, although the budget must focus on, as Professor Nagaraj absolutely correctly said, that it should be an annual statement. Look at what you're promising, what you're doing. Simply take stock of what was promised last year, what has been achieved, etc., instead of thinking in terms of 5 years and 25 years and so on. So I think it's very important to maybe take budgets far more seriously than we have been doing now for several years. So I'm not sort of critiquing just this particular government on this, but then there has been a kind of devaluation for quite some time, which needs to be attended to. A lot of extremely important inputs on the budget came from our wonderful panelists. A lot of suggestions for way forward and so on. So on the macro side, Professor Nagaraj and Professor Ghosh, just to mention one, for instance, the importance of industrial policy. How do we get into that? What do we do about that? And so on. I think absolutely necessary, right? It cannot be done overnight, but at least we should move in that direction and what could be achieved, etc. On both these sectors, especially the areas that Ravi and Jasodhara were focusing on, sort of specifically health education, but also from the gender lens and other social groups. All of us know India's social geography determines its economic geography in extremely profound ways, right? And there's a kind of loop mechanism, feedback mechanism, and then it can easily become a vicious kind of circle, right? Which is what exactly we are seeing. Various figures and facts which were shared with us tell us that. Right? So I think it's very important to take note of these extremely important inputs from our wonderful panelists. Great discussion, right? And finally, on the question of taxes, etc., we have been basically harvesting options which are low-hanging fruit, so to say, but extremely unkind to the people at large, of which the most important example, it has already been mentioned a couple of times, petroleum products. Just think of it. I mean, no country in the world puts this kind of sort of over and above on the cost of the petro products to collect taxes. No country in the world. Right? And why are we doing it? And everyone knows that petro products being universal intermediaries and the implications of that. And yes, so I'll not take any more time, but I thought just to flag a couple of things which could be highlighted further. It's impossible to summarize the wonderful discussion that we have had because there are lots of excellent ideas. So I would not dare to get onto that path. We don't have time, but from my side, I can only express my deep gratitude to Ravi, Jasodhara, Professor Nagaraj, and Professor Ghosh for being part of this excellent conversation. With that, Subrat, the floor is yours.
Thank you, sir. So, before formally thanking everyone, I would just take half a minute to showcase the publication that CBGA team has brought out. I would request my colleagues to please share the link for this publication in the chat box. So this is the report by CBGA on the latest union budget in search of inclusive recovery, and we will also be emailing it tomorrow to each of the participants we have had in this webinar. And the other thing that I would like to draw your attention to is this thing called the Union Budget Explorer 2022-23 on the Open Budgets India portal. It's openbudgetsindia.org. And on this portal, if you come to this particular dashboard, it's called the Union Budget Explorer. What we have done here is we have digitized a lot of the relevant data from the budget documents. We hear so much about digitization in governance, but when it comes to data, I think data is deliberately not digitized within the government system. So we at CBGA have taken it upon ourselves to digitize as much of relevant public finance data as possible. So you find a lot of machine readable data here, and you can generate visualizations, graphs, etc. So just wanted to draw your attention to both our publication and this dashboard on Open Budgets India portal. So many thanks to all our friends who joined us in this discussion today. We are going through the third wave of COVID, and so many people I know in CBGA and outside CBGA have got affected by this third wave. I also know many people who have joined us today have not been well, or their family members have not been well. So I really feel grateful, and our sincere thanks and gratitude to all of you for joining in this, joining us in this discussion today. And special thanks to all the 100+ friends who have stayed on until so late, into the evening. And we are really grateful to our panelists, Professor Nagaraj, Ravi, Jashodhara, and Professor Ghosh for the very wonderful interventions they have made. And special thanks to Professor Jha for moderating it really well. I think it was a very rich discussion, and we really kind of draw a lot of motivation and inspiration from all of you, our panelists, and all our friends who have joined us today. So many thanks to all of you. With that, I think that brings.
Subrat, just one last word. Unfortunately, we could not include some of the questions. It seems some of the raised hands, etc. So our sincerest apologies to them. So we will try and do better next time. So apologies. Yes, Subrat, please.
So that brings us to the closure of today's discussion. But it's been wonderful to have all of you in this discussion.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you and bye, all of you.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye.